The missiles that struck Israeli population centers in recent hours did not simply detonate on impact and end their threat. That is the dimension of what happened that is not being communicated clearly in most coverage. And it is the dimension that will define the consequences of these strikes, not just in the hours after impact, but for months and potentially years afterward. Cluster munition warheads do not function like conventional explosive payloads. When a cluster munition arrives at its programmed altitude, the outer casing fractures and releases dozens of smaller submunitions, each one an independent explosive device carrying its own detonation mechanism. Those submunitions disperse across a wide area, some detonating on impact and some not. The ones that do not detonate on impact do not become inert. They remained live explosive devices on the ground, on rooftops, in courtyards, embedded in soil, sitting in the streets of neighborhoods, waiting for a car to pass over one, for a child to pick one up, for an emergency response team to step on one while clearing debris for a dog, for anyone. Ramadan, Benabra, Lud, Patat, Tikva. These are not remote military zones. They are densely populated urban neighborhoods in the greater Tel Aviv metropolitan area, among the most densely populated urban spaces in Israel. The cluster munitions that arrived there in recent hours have seeded those neighborhoods with unexploded ordnance that emergency disposal teams will spend months attempting to locate and neutralize. Not all of it will be located before someone encounters it. That is not speculation. It is the documented experience of every territory where cluster munitions have been deployed in populated areas. Israel is in the process of becoming a minefield. And when the population emerges from the bomb shelters in the coming hours and days, when children return to streets, when emergency workers move through neighborhoods, when ordinary life attempts to resume, the danger will not be ending. It will be beginning a different, slower, more indiscriminate phase. Subscribe to From Report right now and turn on notifications. What is unfolding in Israeli population centers tonight is not simply a strike event, it is the beginning of a long-duration explosive contamination problem that the coverage of the immediate attack is not adequately communicating, and the analysis of what it means requires historical context that the immediate reporting is not providing. The Oslo Convention on Cluster Munitions, adopted in 2008, exists precisely because the international community documented in exhaustive detail what cluster munitions do to civilian populations. More than 100 countries signed it. The convention prohibits the use, production, transfer, and stockpiling of cluster munitions based on the documented evidence that their indiscriminate effect on civilian populations long after a conflict ends makes them incompatible with international humanitarian law standards. Iran did not sign the convention. The use of cluster munitions against Israeli population centers is therefore not a treaty violation for Iran in the technical legal sense, but it is a violation of the foundational principles of international humanitarian law that the convention was designed to codify, and it is producing exactly the civilian harm that those principles were designed to prevent. The condemnation of Iran's use of cluster munitions against Israeli civilians is appropriate, necessary, and unambiguous. What is happening to civilian neighborhoods in the Tel Aviv metropolitan area tonight is wrong. The submunitions being seeded into those neighborhoods will kill and maim civilians who had nothing to do with the decisions that produced this conflict, not tonight, but weeks and months from now, in the random, indiscriminate way that unexploded cluster ordnance kills. That condemnation, however, cannot be issued in isolation from the full documented record of cluster munition use in this conflict's broader geographic context, because the selective application of international humanitarian law standards is itself a form of political manipulation that this channel will not participate in. Israel did not sign the Oslo Convention on Cluster Munitions either. The south of Lebanon is the case study that tells you precisely what the population centers of the greater Tel Aviv area are now facing. And the timeline it documents should be understood by everyone processing what happened in those neighborhoods tonight. Following the 2006 Lebanon War, Israel deployed cluster munitions extensively across southern Lebanese territory. The United Nations has been conducting unexploded ordnance clearance operations in southern Lebanon continuously since that conflict ended. Not for months, not for years, for nearly 2 decades. UN teams are still finding and neutralizing submunitions in southern Lebanese soil, in agricultural fields, in village pathways, in areas where families returned after the conflict ended, and where children play and farmers work. Human Rights Watch documented the contamination in detail. Amnesty International documented it. The UN issued multiple comprehensive reports on the scale and ongoing human cost of the unexploded ordnance that Israeli cluster munitions left behind. The farming communities of southern Lebanon are among the most documented cases of long-duration cluster munition contamination in the world. Olive groves that have not produced a full harvest in years because the soil is contaminated, agricultural land that farmers cannot work safely, villages where the daily risk of encountering unexploded ordnance is not a historical memory, but a current operational reality. The human cost has not been borne primarily by combatants. It has been borne by farmers, by children, by families who returned to their homes after the fighting stopped and encountered ordnance that the fighting left behind. Southern Lebanon is what the neighborhoods of Ramat Gan, Benetra, Lud, and Petah Tikva are now facing, not as a metaphor, as a documented operational precedent. The mechanism is identical. The submunitions are the same category of weapon. The population density of the Israeli neighborhoods affected tonight is considerably higher than that of southern Lebanese villages. The scale of the contamination problem being created in Israeli urban centers may ultimately exceed what southern Lebanon experienced, not because the weapons are different, but because the target environment is more densely populated. That documented history does not make what Iran did tonight acceptable. It makes it worse because the people who ordered this attack knew exactly what cluster munitions do to civilian populations. They knew because the documentation is comprehensive and publicly available. They chose this weapon category with full knowledge of its long-duration, indiscriminate effects. And it makes the selective nature of the international condemnation analytically significant in a way that cannot be ignored. The international condemnation of Iran's cluster munition deployment against Israeli population centers arrived rapidly and with appropriate force. Western governments, international organizations, human rights bodies. The condemnation infrastructure mobilized with the urgency the situation demands. That same condemnation infrastructure has been documenting Israeli white phosphorus use in Gaza and Lebanon for years. It has been documenting Israeli cluster munition deployment in southern Lebanon since 2006. It has been issuing reports, producing satellite imagery analysis, interviewing survivors, and publishing findings with the same evidentiary rigor that it is applying to Iran's actions tonight. The documentation exists, it is comprehensive, it is publicly available, it has not produced the same rapid, forceful, unified international condemnation that Iran's actions tonight are producing. White phosphorus burns at approximately 800 degrees C. It adheres to surfaces, including human skin, and continues burning regardless of attempts to extinguish it. Water does not stop it. Submersion does not stop it. A fragment of white phosphorus landing on a person's skin will burn through to the bone. Inhaling white phosphorus smoke causes permanent lung damage. Human Rights Watch documented its use in densely populated areas of Gaza. UN investigators documented it in southern Lebanon. The photographic and video evidence of its effects on civilian populations has been available for years. Israel's legal position on white phosphorus is that it deploys the substance as a smoke OKC screen rather than as an incendiary weapon, a characterization that Protocol 3 of the Convention on Certain Conventional Weapons, which prohibits the use of incendiary weapons against civilians, does not accommodate through intent-based exceptions. The documented effects on civilian populations in the areas where white phosphorus has been deployed do not change based on the stated intent of the deploying force. The burns are the same burns, the lung damage is the same lung damage, the deaths are the same deaths. This is not an argument that what Iran did tonight is acceptable because Israel has done comparable things. It is an argument that international humanitarian law either applies universally or it applies politically, and that those are two fundamentally different things being described by the same vocabulary. When the condemnation infrastructure mobilizes rapidly and forcefully against Iranian cluster munitions in Israeli neighborhoods while moving slowly and incompletely against documented white phosphorus use and cluster munition deployment by Israeli forces in civilian areas of Gaza and Lebanon, it is not applying international humanitarian law. It is applying a selective standard that serves political purposes while using the language of universal principle. The children in Gaza who have sustained white phosphorus burns did not choose their nationality. The families in southern Lebanon who encountered unexploded Israeli cluster munitions after the 2006 war did not choose their geography. The civilians in Ramat Gan and Beit Bra, who will encounter unexploded Iranian cluster munitions in the coming weeks, did not choose to live in a country whose government launched a war that produced this outcome. The weapon does not ask any of them who they are before it burns or detonates. International humanitarian law should not ask either. The operational significance of tonight's cluster munition deployment extends beyond its immediate humanitarian consequences and into the strategic picture this channel has been tracking throughout this conflict. The IDF confirmed weeks ago that approximately 50% of Iranian ballistic missiles launched since February 28th have been equipped with cluster munition warheads. Tonight, strikes against the Tel Aviv metropolitan area represent the deployment of that capability against Israel's most densely populated urban zone. Not against military installations, not against industrial infrastructure, but against the residential neighborhoods where the Israeli civilian population lives and where the long-duration contamination effect of cluster munitions will be most consequential. The strategic logic of this targeting decision is the same as the logic this channel identified when cluster warhead deployment was first confirmed. It maximizes the impact of each surviving missile against the defensive architecture that attempts to stop it. When the outer casing fractures at altitude and releases dozens of submunitions, the single incoming target becomes dozens of independent objects moving on slightly different trajectories. The Iron Dome's tracking and engagement algorithms designed around single warhead interception solutions face a fundamentally different computational challenge against cluster dispersion than against conventional payloads. Some will be intercepted, some will not, and the ones that reach the ground in populated areas do not end their threat on impact. The claim that the Iron Dome intercepted the majority of incoming threats, the standard Israeli official characterization of every major strike event in this conflict, requires the same analytical scrutiny it has required throughout this conflict. The operational evidence on the ground, the 58 people wounded in Sashia, the 2 elderly civilians killed in their home by shrapnel, the destroyed train station, the neighborhoods without power, the unexploded ordnance now distributed across multiple densely populated communities, describes a different outcome than a majority interception success rate would produce. What Israeli officials describe as intercepted fragments that caused incidental damage on the way down are, in the case of cluster munitions, potentially the intended outcome of a weapon designed to defeat exactly the binary hit or miss mathematics of missile interception systems. Trump stated this morning that Iran had been reduced to a shadow of its former military capability. He described Iranian offensive capacity as essentially spent, degraded beyond the ability to conduct significant operations. That statement was published and broadcast as the administration's authoritative assessment of where this conflict's military balance stood. The operational record of the hours that followed that assessment is the most direct available response to it. Cluster munitions seeding the Tel Aviv metropolitan area with unexploded ordnance. 58 wounded in Sarsieh in the Lower Galilee, 2 civilians dead from shrapnel in their home. A train station destroyed neighborhoods without power. And the documented confirmation that these strikes were part of a coordinated operation involving 5 hours of continuous fire against more than 50 Israeli targets conducted the previous night by a force that the Secretary of Defense had simultaneously described as approaching military irrelevance. The gap between the official capability assessment and the operational demonstration has now accumulated across 16 days of this conflict into something that cannot be explained by the normal lag between battlefield reality and official communication. It has become a structural feature of how this conflict is being communicated to the public. And the structural feature it reveals is that the public characterization of Iranian military capability has been consistently calibrated to serve a political narrative about the conflict's trajectory rather than to accurately describe the operational conditions that American, Israeli, and allied military personnel are actually operating under. That is not a peripheral analytical point. The decisions being made about escalation, deployment, negotiation, and commitment in this conflict are being made by governments whose publics are receiving systematically inaccurate information about the operational balance, the political cost of accurate communication, acknowledging that a force described as spent is conducting cluster munition strikes against Tel Aviv neighborhoods exceeds what the administrations managing this conflict are prepared to pay. So the assessments continue to describe a degraded adversary, while the operational record describes something considerably different. The historical moment that this conflict has now reached deserves to be named clearly. The unwritten rules that governed Middle Eastern conflict for decades have dissolved. The implicit constraints that kept cluster munitions out of Israeli urban centers, that kept Iranian ballistic missiles away from the Tel Aviv metropolitan area's residential neighborhoods, that kept the shadow war between Iran and Israel from becoming the open war that the last 16 days have documented. Those constraints are gone. What replaced them is a conflict in which both sides are deploying weapons that international humanitarian law prohibits in civilian areas, targeting populations that had no voice in the decisions that put them in the path of this war, and producing long-duration humanitarian consequences that will outlast any ceasefire by years. The south of Lebanon has been a minefield for 2 decades because of cluster munitions deployed in a conflict that ended in 2006. The neighborhoods of the greater Tel Aviv metropolitan area are now entering a version of that same trajectory. The timelines are different. The scale may ultimately be larger. The mechanism is identical. When the dust settles, when the bomb shelters empty, and the population attempts to return to ordinary life, the danger will not be receding. It will be distributed across the ground they walk on, waiting in the places they cannot see, indifferent to who they are and what they believe about the conflict that put it there. Condemning Iran's cluster munition use against Israeli civilians is correct and necessary. Condemning it in isolation from the documented record of comparable weapons used by other parties in this and related conflicts is not the application of principle. It is the application of politics using the language of principle. And this channel will not participate in that selective framing, regardless of which direction the political pressure runs. Subscribe to From Report and turn on notifications. When the unexploded ordnance clearance operations begin in Tel Aviv neighborhoods and the scale of the contamination problem becomes visible, the analysis will be here. When the international community's condemnation of Iranian cluster munition use is tested against the documented record of comparable weapons deployment in Gaza and Lebanon, the analysis will be here when the official capability assessments are tested against the next operational demonstration of Iranian military capacity. The analysis will be here. Evidence first, analysis second, what it means for you always.